Another quote, I just like getting away from the house. There's just too much arguing, too much stress. And this is a child who is witnessing domestic violence and tremendous dysfunction at home. Sometimes kids who have been traumatized have regression of milestones, and we see that a lot with the little kids. You know, kids who have been toilet trained, they're 5, they've been toilet trained for a couple of years, and they start peeing in their bed or having accidents at school, and that's a sign of stress and their reaction to it. Some kids will be very clingy. One foster parent said to me, it was so annoying. She was very intolerant. She said, it was so annoying. This 8-year-old boy is just following me around. You know, every time I do the laundry, he's right there. I turn around, he's right there. Because he's, you know, that's his way of just getting some sense of stability. And so that lack of separation. Sometimes kids will recreate trauma. We see this a lot with sexual abuse, kids acting out sexually on other kids. And in sort of a way you think, okay, that makes a lot of sense. If you've been a victim of some pretty horrendous sexual abuse, if you can act it out on somebody else, you're role switching. Now you're in control. That's sort of changing the end of the story. Instead of making yourself that vulnerable child who has no control, now you're acting out on somebody else and you do have control. So they may recreate the trauma. They may draw pictures like this. That is making them sort of mull things over and see things, sort of relive the experience. Some kids become very obsessed with their own safety or the safety of somebody else. So a child in foster care may be saying to the foster mother all the time, how's my mom? Is my mom still alive? Is she okay? Do you think she's okay? What about now? You think she's okay now? The next day, is she okay? Is she still alive? That kind of real sort of perseverating on the safety of themselves or somebody else. And then we all know the kids who are become very aggressive. They're the kids who are bullying in school and acting out a lot, who may be beating up the other foster kids, for example. Kids who are hyper-aroused. They're very quick to react. Something happens and they're, boom, right there. They expect the worst, they see the worst, and they're jumping on it immediately. They're always sort of looking for threats. And that might be a sign of severe traumatic stress. And I think that we see in a lot with abused kids misinterpretation of others' facial expressions and behaviors. And there are actually some good studies that look at the effects of physical abuse. And kids who have been physically abused tend to focus more on angry faces. And once they latch on, if you show them a bunch of different faces of different, I think it's the next slide, you show them a bunch of faces like that, and they'll tend to bias towards the angry face. And once they engage with that angry face, it's harder for them to distract themselves. And so they're much more attuned to that. Kids who are victims of neglect tend to do the same thing with sad faces, for example. So there's differences in interpreting facial emotions. Things that I might look at you and say, that's a very neutral expression on your face. Another child may see that as hostile and see it as a threat. So we can see that these traumatic stress, all these behaviors we're talking about, can sort of help explain some of these things that we see with child maltreatment. These kids who have been maltreated are all at increased risk for all of these things. So the behavior problems may lead to substance abuse, certainly lead to low self-esteem, problems with attachment, depression, anxiety. Those kinds of things really kind of begin to make sense when we look at the trauma symptoms that go along with traumatic stress. But we need to look deeper, because there's some other things that are not so easily explained. For example, the personality disorders, the lower IQ. How does this all fit in? And I think that takes us to the next step when we look at early brain development. You think about kids who are exposed to early trauma, whether it be child abuse or neglect or other trauma, and what that does to the brain. So this is a really quick trauma overview of brain development, and I hope it doesn't trigger any traumatic stress for you. You're thinking about your biology days. We're going to make this really fast, but there are a couple things that I just want to emphasize. The brain development, depends on our genes. Some of us have genes that make us more resilient to things than others, and others of us have genes that make us more vulnerable to things than others. So there's a lot of the genetic makeup, and so that's very important, but experience is really key, and I want to focus on that. Because experience really influences the way the brain is constructed. Our experiences really literally dictate the wiring in our brain. The circuits that are laid down in our brain in a baby, in a child, in a youth, and a young adult's brain are influenced by our experiences. Some of the wiring is made very, very strong because we've had certain experiences, and other wiring just kind of withers away because it's never used. There's wiring connections that are made because of experiences, new connections, and others are withering away. So the whole brain development, the whole setup of the brain is dependent on experiences. Different areas of the brain develop at different rates. So there's areas of the brain that take a really long time to mature, and they're just beginning to kick into gear as a child makes 2 or 3 years of age, and they're not done until late 20s, some would even say 30s. So it's a long process, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There are other areas that are, boom, they're mature right as soon as you're born. They have to be, that area of the brain that controls breathing, that work. If that weren't mature, you wouldn't make it past the newborn period, would you? So you have to come out with a certain amount of brain maturation. But in the interim, from the beginning to the late 20s, different areas of the brain are sort of turning on and maturing. And I also want to emphasize one really key thing that I think is really important, and that is when you think about brain development, people talk about abnormal brain development for maltreated kids. Their brains are abnormal. They're not abnormal. I would suggest that we think of them as adaptive changes to the brain. The brain is developing according to its environmental stress. So if it's in a maladaptive environment, it's going to develop in a way that's going to encourage survival for that child. Now, it may be maladaptive when they're in a safe environment, but it's not an abnormal brain. I think that's an important concept. And then, okay, so we're talking about maturity of the brain. And so there are these windows of opportunity and certain sensitive periods where the brain becomes very primed to mature, sort of entering adolescence, kind of the growth spurt, think of it that way. So there's a part of the brain that says, okay, I'm ready to mature. And so it's just a window of opportunity. It doesn't like snap open on Wednesday and snap closed on next Thursday. It's kind of a gradual process. But one area of the brain becomes primed to change, and it's very, very vulnerable to experiences because it's beginning to lay down all its wiring. So the experiences that happen at that point have a tremendous impact on that area of the brain. It's laying down circuits, it's making connections, it's pruning back other connections because it's very, very vulnerable. And the experiences that happen in the beginning of that sensitive period have a much bigger impact than the ones at the end. So let's say you have a 3-year sensitive period. The experiences you have in the first year and a half are really influential. By the time you get to 2 years and 9 months, some of the experiences are going to change, but not a whole lot. So that's how that area of the brain is maturing, and then it finally sort of eventually closes that window of opportunity. But keep in mind, it doesn't slam it shut for good. There are very few areas of the brain that cannot undergo change after that window of opportunity. Thank the Lord, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be any point in us reading books or even sitting here and talking, because we wouldn't be able to learn anything new. So plasticity is really important. So if a child has a really bad upbringing, that doesn't mean that they can't change their brain and make fundamental changes in their beliefs, in their environment, and their behaviors later on. It just becomes harder as you get older. And think about, I think language is the best example. Think about your 3-year-old, your 3-year-old granddaughter, or niece, or nephew, whatever. A 3-year-old can pick up Chinese right like that. You hire a Chinese nanny, boom, that child will pick up Chinese. But if I tried to pick up Chinese, I couldn't utter a word. And it would take me forever of constant tutoring to get a basic language because I'm well out of the language sensitive period. I can learn it, but it's going to be very, very difficult. So neuroplasticity, or the ability to change and to influence the brain, even though you're not in that sensitive period, persists throughout life, but it becomes harder as we get older. It's harder to pick up Chinese or Spanish or whatever later on in life. And I put this up here to indicate that plasticity has its limits. So a child who has severe brain damage, such as this child does, this is a child who is shaken, an abusive head trauma baby. And you can see where all this light part of the brain is severely damaged. Now some of that is going to be able to, there's going to be some compensation. So they'll recover a little bit, but there are limits. And so the child's brain is not going to completely recover. So, okay, so this is the part that's going to be over in 3 minutes. So, and it's really important to kind of get these 3 players. There are 3 areas of the brain that are really important in terms of stress and brain development. And one of them is the amygdala. The amygdala is like the emotional center of the brain. Whenever you have a meltdown, a fight with your spouse or something, or you're really, really upset about something, that's your amygdala kicking in and sort of taking over things. It's the emotional area of the brain. It stores and makes emotional memories. If you remember something really frightening, that frightening part of the memory, the fear, is stored in your amygdala. All the context of what makes that experience what it is stored somewhere else, but the fear, the emotion is stored there. It's also monitoring the environment for threats. It's like a big radar screen. So it's really your survival key, and it has to mature very early in life. So it's always looking for threats in the environment, and it's kind of very fast but stupid. And so it will see if there's any suggestion of a threat, it launches the stress response. And we'll see how this works in just a minute. But it's really an important thing because its emotions are stored there, and it's the source of the stress response. And it's regulated by other areas, thank heavens, otherwise we would totally be just emotional wrecks and not be able to do anything. The hippocampus is the other second big player, and this is kind of the boring area of the brain. It's also storing an area for learning and memory, but it's really sort of contextual memory and just the facts. So if you have a very frightening experience, a child who, or think of yourself, you're on a hike, and you're walking along and suddenly you start to slip and you fall down almost into a ravine. That is very scary. slide down, you can barely stop yourself. Very frightening experience. So the emotion, that fear, that horror, is stored in the amygdala. But the context of just the facts and the context of the experience, you're out on, it's a sunny day, it's a Saturday afternoon, you're on this trail, it's a dirt trail, there's a ravine to your left and you slide, there's a stone and you slide. All that facts, all that context is stored in the hippocampus. And that's the area that allows you to get contextual memory, very, very important for learning. And it's got a very long period of maturation, so it's vulnerable for a very long period, vulnerable to stress. It becomes a big player. We'll see how in a minute. And then finally, your prefrontal cortex, or your superego, is the area that develops for a very long period. It's only just beginning to start developing in a 2 or 3 year old, and it doesn't finish until late 20s or so. And that's the area that is responsible for executive functions. Your planning, your decision making, weighing the risks and the benefit, deciding what to do, pulling all the information from your brain, and just making a plan. And so it's the executive function. And it interacts with the amygdala, because somebody has to control your emotions, right? So your prefrontal cortex does that. It's like your superego. Okay, so think about those areas. The amygdala is so key to survival. It's got to mature very early. So it's going to be maturing very quickly in the first years of life. But the prefrontal cortex, as I mentioned, just kicking in at 2 years or 3 years, very primitively mature, and then continues until the 20s. And the hippocampus, sort of the same thing, but a little bit matures faster than the prefrontal cortex. So think about all these areas of the brain are maturing over time. Well, what happens in real life? You have a child who's a very young infant. They have a couple of things they have to do as an infant. They're challenged with a few homework assignments. They have to be able to learn to regulate their behavior and their emotions. So at some point during infancy, they have to learn how to be able to stop crying and put themselves to sleep. So sort of gain this basic control. When they get very stressed and hungry and they're crying, eventually they sort of learn to be able to calm themselves down. And that's a key developmental milestone. And it's really important because it's the early experiences with stress. And the early experiences with stress is going to dictate how we respond to stress for the rest of our lives. So having an early, compassionate caregiver who can help the child learn how to calm themselves down will teach the child how to handle stress. And that in turn lays down the correct circuits in the brain that's going to make for a healthy response to stress. If you have somebody who's totally ignoring the child, who's in a drug stupor, or is hitting the child, or causing more stress, not helping the child learn how to deal with stress, then the child gets more and more stressed and is unable to control it. And that's going to make further experiences in their life with stress very, very difficult. It sort of lowers the threshold. Further on in life, it'll lower the threshold so that they are triggered to get stressed at low thresholds, and it's harder for them to control it. So that's a key developmental milestone. You've got to be laying down those circuits early on in life. And the other thing is attachment is such a big deal. Remember, attachment occurs in the first 2 years of life or so, and that's that very, very fundamental brain development where you're developing relationships with a caregiver, one or more caregivers, and it really serves to lay the foundation for how you're going to see yourself and the world and your relationships with others. And it has a fundamental influence on the way you have relationships with others for the rest of your life. So that early attachment is really important, and those experiences are laying down the wires in your brain, and it's forming the wires in your brain that are very influential for later on. If you have a child who is being neglected and the parent is in a drug stupor and so they're not responding to the child's hunger and they're not getting what they want, the child is going to lay down the groundwork in their brain, the wiring in their brain that says a couple of things. One, I can't get what I need. It's a very stressful world. It's a dangerous world. I'm not worth having anyone come to me because when I cry, nobody does anything. So I'm an unlovable kid, and there's no one out there to help me. Those are the wires that are being laid down, and that's the experience the child is going to have. And that's called an internal working model. So it's a fancy way of saying it's the way the child is going to view the world. All subconscious, of course, but it's being laid down by these early experiences. And kids who are neglected or maltreated, kids who are whacked upside the head when they do something and they can't control when it happens, are going to have a very different experience about the world and their relationship to others, their safety in the world, the safety of other people, are going to have very different attachment than children who are nurtured. And their needs are met, and they're assured that the world is a safe place and that they are worth being cared for. Somebody is there looking after them. Very different.